moving into what's uncomfortable, both in the external world, what looks like the external world, and inside myself, is imperative to getting to know myself and trust myself and feel well. To reach any degree of peace, much less joy, I've had to move toward the discomfort over and over again. It's not the same as living in discomfort because it passes, but hiding from it really just makes it bigger and more painful.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. To the next episode of Poetry of Predicament podcast. And the focus of 2019 and 2020 is to bring forth as many exemplars of advanced practices in the face of predicament and collapse as we can find. This week we have Melissa Allison, who is yet another exemplar from the lineage of Louise LeBrun, also spoken with recently with Deb Gleason and Deb Ozarko and many others. These are all folks who have taken on the practices that bring on empowerment, aliveness, and an extraordinary amount of presence, regardless of the circumstances at the local or the global level. Our question for Melissa Allison today is, what's it like to be taking on these advanced practices while still being neck deep in the business as usual world? Please join us in welcoming Melissa Allison. All right, welcome to yet another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. Remarkable year, this 2020. We're still in January of 2020, and I have really since middle of 2019 taken a stand to find thought leaders and exemplars of people with something to say at the extraordinary level, the existential level of the most important conversation that humanity has ever had to face, which is the human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems and how we're actually in the midst of it. That's the beating heart of what this body of work is, that is livingresilience.net, that is safe circle support meetings and resilience coaching, and Deep Academy, our online learning series meant to empower people, resource people who are brave enough to take on this conversation and live it. And it has been my robust pleasure to speak with a number of people who, in my view, are taking on advanced practices. They aren't just kind of nibbling on this conversation or sticking their toe in the water, I guess would be better. They're really diving in deep to this conversation, and not just as an intellectual pursuit, but really taking it on experientially. Like, what does it mean to expand our capacities in the face of greater and greater stressors on local and on a global scale? And part of those conversations, a significant part of those conversations, have been informed by, or been including people who, virtually all women at this point, who have been studying the work of Louise LeBrun and her well systems work. And, you can remember, you can check out the other episodes that include Louise herself and Deb Ozarko and her partner, Deb Gleason, and the list goes on and on. Today's guest is one of those lineage, and Melissa Allison is not only someone who's engaged in that work, which I'm betting we'll speak about a bit today, but we've also met Melissa and I, around the Deep Adaptation Forum and the Deep Adaptation community or conversation, if you will, something that really got birthed last year by Jem Bendell, its founder. And one thing I've noticed about you, Melissa, that I've enjoyed every time we've talked, which has been quite a few times connected to these various, mostly deep adaptation things, is you are a person who has had quite a clarity and quite a distinction base as you express yourself about when we've been talking about our agreements or disagreements about deep adaptation distinctions or whatever it is that we happen to be talking about. There's a very particular way you're able to articulate what your reality is around these conversations that are really on the leading edge of this extraordinary existential level conversation. And so I've got to call you on a little bit. You were a little bit surprised, I think, when I invited you to do this conversation, this podcast interview. And I will also be full disclosure here for you. I was also asked by a couple of other members of your lineage in Louise's work, could we have Melissa talk? I think she has a lot to say. So you've got something of a fan base, and I am certainly there in that fan base. And I think you bring a remarkable overlap of a number of pieces that I'm predicting viewers of this podcast will be able to relate to. And I think that's an extraordinarily important skill to have now, because unfortunately, podcasts like this are not common. I'm not finding a lot of conversations in the public domain right now meant to empower people to expand their inner toolkit, their inner capacity to be present in the face of larger and larger stressors. And on top of that, to be able to articulate their process as they're doing that, to be able to share it in a way that might be useful to others. So that for me is why I'm excited that you're here and that we're having this conversation. So yay. So thanks for sitting through all that introduction. And out of that, I've said almost nothing about really who you are. I don't actually know a lot about you and your life. And so I'm wondering if there's anything that you'd like to fill in, how you might like to be known, elements of your own story or context that might help us just understand, wow, how did you land here with those skills? What gets you to this place where you're conversant in some really diverse things that might really help? If you shared them, others could see a similar bridge for themselves. So, Melissa, thanks so much. I'm going to stop talking. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself, and off we go?
Yeah, thank you, Dean. I always think, how do I want to be known, is kind of a cosmic question. I feel like I already am known to myself, so I almost want to say nothing. But for the purposes of this conversation, I think it might be useful to know that my path has involved becoming vegan. I think that's a big part of getting me to where I am now. It happened because of the non-human animals and my deep compassion, love for them. And then once I went vegan, it became sort of, it's not that I ever had illusions about our economic system or our political system, but going vegan really dropped a veil for me, and I saw a completely new reality about what's going on in our daily lives, in our refrigerators, you know, what we're putting into our bodies that I had never considered it in quite that way until I actually did it. You know, it was different from knowing about it. And that's kind of a metaphor for what this whole journey has become for me. I actually came to this lineage, as you call it, initially through Deb Gleason, who you've interviewed. And it was because she has a 30-day meal plan that basically kept me eating when I first went vegan. And through that, I found Deb Ozarko's podcast, which I listened to. I wasn't a big podcast listener, but I listened to it occasionally and got her emails when she would write a blog post. And one day, several years ago, she wrote about hopium and collapse and said, it's too late. And it blew my mind. It rocked my world. It changed. It was like another veil dropping, but as true as it rang to me, and as much as I believed it, I didn't want to do anything about it. So I continued on my path, my spiritual path, which at that time involved going on a few kind of modern day Zen retreats and, you know, silent retreats, and doing kind of a Zen practice at home, and what Sherry Huber calls a recording and listening practice, which was potent and meant a lot to me. And I did a form of therapy that was really meditation therapy, dealing with what was going on in that very moment. So it was training, you know, it was still spiritual training, and not much looking into my history like most people do in therapy. And then Deb Ozarko's book, Beyond Hope, came out, and I got it immediately. I think I got it the first day it was published. And I read it, and the first half just rang so true to me. The first half is a litany of what humans have done and how we've come to this place. And then the second half is more about her spiritual journey, which also was so compelling to me. It was a real turning point in the way I thought about myself and the world and our predicament. Even then, I kept going about my business as usual, which involved some spirituality. You know, I'd say I never took spirituality for granted. I never put it completely on a back burner, but I didn't go for it completely either. And the reason I finally went for it was the science. I didn't have, while what Deb was writing rang true to me, I didn't have my own intuition about collapse being so near. I thought it probably was. I thought she was probably right. I thought it was definitely coming. But I didn't have my own intuition about it being so near, and I wasn't willing to act on, at that time, what I considered, you know, someone else's intuition. And then Jem Bendell came out with that paper, which I found a little over a year ago now. And that was when I'd been grieving. That was when I decided it was time to really take all of this very seriously, that life was short, that there wasn't going to be another time to work on this. And I started having serious conversations with myself and with people who are involved in these spiritual paths about what to do next. Deb Ozarko points pretty clearly to Louise LeBrun's website, and I had a some email exchanges with her where she also said, you know, you might want to look into this. I think at some point Louise had made, you know, the first disc from decloaking free. So I went on there and I listened to it, and I bought it and listened to the whole thing and started this spiritual journey that I guess has led me, definitely took me out of any remaining grief that I had. I had dealt with a lot of that myself, but it also has pointed a way forward toward how to live life now, how to live life joyfully, how to be in touch with myself, and how to accept what's happening.
Okay. You caught me making notes frantically over here on this side of the conversation. There are lots of directions I want to go, but I'd like to loop back into one small piece of what you just shared. You mentioned that you had some connection with, some resonance with how Deb Ozarko, in the first half of her book, Beyond Hope, really laid out the destruction of our ecosystem and so on. Then something you called the science, in addition to other sources that you were calling the science, and then kind of the last straw seemed to be the deep adaptation paper from Jem Bendell. And what you described from there was you had been like that was enough. That was enough to nudge you over a threshold to have you engage more fully or possibly completely. I don't know. You seem to be implying something like that. Far more immersion and commitment than before. I know that I had my own kind of threshold moment as well. And the way I describe it is I vetted the material to my satisfaction that really I knew from moment one when I heard it that either this was the craziest bullshit to come down the pike, or this is the transformation of humanity, whether we're ready for it or not. That's how it showed up for me. And that got me on my path to vetting the material one way or the other. When I got to vetting it, that was my threshold of like, this is the transformation of my life. And it's all been, cascading out of that moment. I'm curious if there's anything else you would like to say about that threshold moment, because you described it so, almost nonchalantly, like, yeah, then I did this and then I read that and then pretty much I made this life-changing, forever transformation of my life. And then, so what do you want to talk about now? I'm being silly. But you did have kind of a relaxed nonchalance about describing it. And I'm curious, I don't need you to match the significance that I'm putting on it. That's just significant for me. But I'm curious if there's anything else you can say about that threshold moment, because in my experience, we're on the cusp of a time that some number of people are on that threshold. They're on that edge. And something is going to nudge them over into, oh shit, this is really happening. And I need to transform myself to be able to even be present in it. So I hope that's communicating. And I'm just wondering if there's anything else you'd like to say about your kind of transition, that ultimate threshold transition.
I see what you're saying, Dean. I don't have a lot of charge around it now, but I can describe what it was like for me. There were a number of thresholds. So I can describe the biggest one. I've described what it was like, the first ones, reading Deb's blog post and then Beyond Hope. The science for me was my own discovery that the Paris Agreement, which has various emission scenarios, involves a scenario that is literally, technically, currently impossible, withdrawing carbon from the air. And when I saw that, and I thought, this is what we're hanging our hat on, and some people are talking about this scenario as an actual possibility for humans to survive, I just thought, we're crazy. Something's really wrong. We've gone off the rails when this is what politicians and scientists are doing. That was the first, that was my impetus to go dig into the science myself. And in doing so, in vetting it myself, I found Jem Bendel's paper, and I was shattered. It was not a foreign concept to me, so it wasn't completely out of the blue, but I was still shattered. You're right. The threshold point is one where, for me, I laid on the bed. I don't remember if I read it on my computer at work or at home, but I remember that night, and for many nights after, I just laid on the bed flat. I was flattened. I was shocked. I was just having to grasp that this is the end of my life and the lives of everyone I love, and that we had done it, which, as a vegan, thinking of all of the animals that we've done this to is just devastating when I put myself back in that place of remembering what it was like. Yeah, and I remember talking to my husband about it, and there was no doubt. It wasn't like I was trying to argue it away. There was no denial. I was ready for this information. I was ready to believe it, but believing it took a number of days, and a resolve that I wasn't going to let my pursuit of my own soul be delayed any longer, that I was going to go for it completely.
Yeah. And if I could just ask a clarifying question. So when I understand a number of elements that you're kind of combining that came together to get you to that threshold. And you keep mentioning about Jem Bendel's paper. And what I keep hearing as you are describing, because this was my experience of his paper, was his use of the word collapse. Mm-hmm. There were two major courage points that I would say that Jem exhibited in grand fashion. One was to name the complete and utter failure of the idea of the sustainability of humanity and the human operating system. I'd say that's a huge act of power in terms of taking the risk of being completely annihilated from his field of sustainability leadership. But that's one thing. And then the other was to go from climate change, which is obviously in my book, in my reading of it, a completely contrived, controlled narrative that is a small fraction of what is actually going on the planet. That's another story. But he, in how he expresses himself in that initial paper and then in subsequent work, is that he goes right from there to the notion of collapse, that we are causing collapse of Earth and human systems. Particularly, he focuses on his prediction of the collapse of our food systems, food production systems. So the word collapse is what really got my attention when I read it. Mm-hmm. That's what had me say, I want to interview that guy. there's something I resonate with. He is speaking more boldly and more truthfully than just about anybody else in the field right now. I'm curious if the word collapse is what you're responding to, that rang for you in Jem's communication, or was there something else?
That's funny. I don't remember the first time I heard collapse. I would have thought it was through Deb Ozarko, but possibly not. I don't remember it having been that word. With Jem's paper, what resonated for me were two things. One was that the science he was describing, he described the science meticulously, and he sourced it, and I checked some of that out, and it rang true for what I understood about how science works. You know, how in academia people work on very narrow fields and they go very deep into that, and there hasn't been a lot of cross examination of how these fields affect each other. Just so many things. I mean, I could go on and on about how I trusted the way he was putting together the science, and I vetted it, you know, to whatever extent I could myself, and it all rang true. The part that made it seem imminent was him saying it was imminent. I mean, he said 10 years and backed that up. And the way that I see him as having backed it up, what collapse means for me is, as you said, well beyond climate change. It's an ecosystem collapse. But also, he talked about the food systems and about how our crops are likely to fail given how erratic the weather is becoming and how fast those changes are ramping up. Our crops are likely to fail. Rang true to me on so many levels. As a reporter, I covered food for several years and learned about how crops work. A lot of us know how crops work anyway, but it all just rang true to me. And then he said, you know, the markets, the financial markets are going to handle this in such a way that they will collapse. And that also rang true to me. I covered banking for many years. I covered the commodities markets in Chicago for a while. That rang true. I thought that is how those two dominoes will fall. And I sort of filled in the rest myself. I think he has things about what will happen next, but you know, that was all my imagination needed to cause, you know, me to be flat on my back and saying, I've got to do something now. I can't wait.
Yeah. Thank you. Once again, I'm writing notes frantically on this side of the conversation. It's really good to meet someone who has a similar kind of set of switches. I don't know what the right way of saying it is, but things that toggle, like from kind of on my radar, oh my God, this is important. And, you know, when I was researching and then writing my book and in subsequent conversations, which I call the impossible conversations, it just blows my mind that more people don't think like what you've just said, because it just makes total sense to me. That's exactly what my progression was like. I saw this piece, that piece, that piece, vetted it, boom, that's all I needed. And I look around me to this day, it just staggers me that the vast majority of this world, including people in the most powerful positions on the planet, do not process in that way. Somewhere on the other end of the spectrum from there. So just a bit of my sharing of what I call the naive part of me. Mm-hmm. Oh, well. If you don't mind, I'd like to shift gears, because what appears obvious to me is that you have plenty of the earlier experience of being somewhat informed, somewhat engaged in the conversation, and being in your particular pocket of the business as usual world, living life, just doing life. And you've now spelled out some of what it was like to transition. What are some of the elements that had really nudged you into transitioning over the threshold into taking on life, living life in a very different way than we tend to do, even as pretty awake people in the business as usual world? But I believe that what, really, but my experience directly in these conversations is that what you and I get to share about is something that really only a very few people on the planet appear to be interested in. Very few people are interested in even having longer than a 30-second conversation about climate change, much less what we're about to talk about. And what we're about to talk about is one of the few things that really keeps me engaged in this conversation at all. Because I'm not doing this work to save anything, to necessarily be an activist for anything, to convince anybody of anything. Because where I've landed, and it seems like where you've landed as well, certainly where Deb Ozarko has landed, is that there is no there. We've passed all the off-ramps that were about saving something or changing something or transforming humanity and blah, blah, blah. That's not why I'm doing this. It's just for people who might be new to this conversation, I should put in the caveat: I am the last person to get in anyone's way who is sincerely moved in their life to be an activist at any level, to be wanting to make a difference at any level. God bless you. Go for it. Please do that. And if there's anything I can offer from the body of work and the inner toolkit that I'm assembling for this body of work, I would love to do nothing more than to empower you in your path to activism, or your path to making a difference in your family or your community or on a global level, please. But there's a different level that the work that I believe we're about to talk about lives on. It is not a work, and this, I can say that about a number of bodies of work that I am bringing together into this toolkit that I keep talking about, this figurative toolkit. So this work of Louise LeBrun and this lineage that we keep talking about, it's not about doing enough of this work so that we can go out and be activists and get the right people to vote for the right people and blah, blah, blah. And it's not about that. It is about an extraordinary shift of our primary attention, and intent is a word that I can bring from yet another lineage that literally transforms lives. And I find it extraordinarily difficult to relay this conversation we're about to transition into to people who are still up to their earlobes in the business as usual conversation. It's almost impossible to hear when we're completely immersed in our daily lives, and that's all we've ever known. So that's why I'm doing this conversation and these conversations and this body of work, is to find a way to bridge from people like yourself who have a visceral experience of living in a new way. And maybe, just maybe, through a particular quality of sharing some of that experience in your own life, there may be some others who can hear, like, oh, she's saying she went from here to there. And it's different in this way and that way. Oh, So, is there anything that I've said that sparks you to share about the differences you might be experiencing in your life now as opposed to before crossing that threshold?
Yes, yes. I agree that it's very hard to convey, Dean, but let's go for it.
Hey!
Something you said about a shift in intent reminded me of a phrase, shift in consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard that phrase for years. And I think that activists use that phrase. They want the people they consider to be doing business as usual to have a shift in consciousness toward doing right by nature, by animals, by humans. And I've also thought lately about what choice used to mean to me. I'm American, and I'm a privileged American, being white, middle class. I've had the privilege of being able to make a lot of choices in my life. And I think a lot of people who get the information about collapse are that. And they think that making a choice is something they've always been doing. I have a new idea about what making a choice means and what consciousness means to me now. And it's hard to describe, but it's so palpable. I see that the world I was living in and the consciousness that I had was still business as usual. Even though I was vegan, even though I was marching, doing lots of other forms of activism, I was still making choices based on what I knew, based on how I was raised, based on what the system had taught me about what works and what doesn't work. Raising Cain works, right? If you yell loud enough, if you march enough, if you sign enough petitions, send enough letters, if there are enough of us, things will change. It took me a long time to get my head around, my heart around the idea that that is not a different consciousness. That was the same consciousness I was raised with. Getting to a different level of consciousness and to real change inside of ourselves, and if enough of us did it, I suppose outside of ourselves, means going inside. And it doesn't mean going inside like people do when they go to traditional therapy. It doesn't mean venting about your parents or some wrong that was done to you. It doesn't mean venting about the ecosystem or capitalism. To me, it means coming face to face with myself, with the life that I had created for myself, given the choices that I'd been making all along, and deciding to make more conscious ones going forward, to make different decisions based on what I found in my heart, based on a deeper relationship with myself.
Mm-hmm. Right. Is this a good pause point? May I ask another question? So, there, having been exposed to some of the distinctions of Louise's work, in particular the what she calls the decloaking series, this CD set that's extensive, and the recording of a workshop that she's led, and one piece that showed up time and time again, one distinction that she actually unfolds quite early in the work is about being internally referent at an extraordinary level. So if we could say that the business as usual world immerses us from birth on to be externally referent. We find out who we are by looking out there and seeing what the feedback is from out there about us. And so our attention and intent is constantly going out to get stuff to bring back to us, including our own self-esteem, our own experience of who we are, and so on. And so what I'm hearing you say in a slightly different way is you shifted to that more internally referent and present referent orientation to being alive. And again, just out of a contrast that in what little I understand about the work you're describing is the business as usual orientation for presence in a sense of time is that it's anything but present in the moment. Like the business as usual time frame is something about the future or something about the past, and the least amount of intent and attention is actually deployed in the present moment. So what I think I'm hearing you say is that you made that transition in your experience of the work to that more present orientation and that more internally referent orientation for both the deployment of your attention and your presence.
Yes.
Is that safe to say? And if there's anything you'd like to change in my recap, could you offer that?
That is what I'm talking about. I think there are a lot of ways to say it. The way that you said it resonated for me. The way that I, honestly, I'm changing the way I think about it all the time, sometimes daily.
Yeah.
The way that I thought about it when I went to the decloaking experience in person with Sheila Winter Wallace, which was really the beginning of my accelerating this journey. I thought of it as my heart. As I got into that retreat, I could physically feel my heart. I still can, but I remember becoming aware of it and wanting to honor it. And that does mean being in the present moment. You can really only do that in the present moment. You can really only make choices in the present moment also. So it all fits together for me.
Got it. So here we are. A person who is very bright, very engaged in life, doing really well in the business as usual paradigm, and gets kind of smacked with pieces of information and others sharing their framing of what's going on, and it just smack and smack until finally, okay, wow, this is actually happening, and somehow you've gotten yourself to that threshold at the same time having these extraordinarily uncomfortable realizations going on, and at the same time being exposed to some other ways of being and some other people who have taken on these other ways of being. So it's not just a class you can go do and that's it. Actually, it can become something of a support community, even though you live hundreds or thousands of miles apart. There's a way of experiencing it as something of a support network. Is that safe to say?
It is, and it gets even bigger than that. I think I cannot know why anyone else makes the decisions they do, but I do know people in my life who are pretty aware of collapse, who believe that it's coming and it's coming soon, and they just don't know what to do about it. They think that their choices are grief or living, you know, permanent grief or living. They don't think that there's another way. And then there are people who aren't aware that collapse is happening at all. So to find people who have those two things is rare, and you stay in touch with them. They mean a lot. And when I came back to Seattle, where I live, I brought this to my friends, not all of whom, my closest friends, not all of whom are even now collapse aware. They know that I am. They know what I talk about. They don't talk about it the way that I do, but they're interested in this. I'm so grateful. And so I'm hoping to expand the community. I hope for myself that I'll have more people to talk to about what's going on inside of me. And so little of it, honestly, is collapse anymore. I see the news and I accept it. I mean, the stuff that was happening in Australia was heartbreaking, and the images of the animals and the numbers of animals really hit me at first. And I don't dwell on it. I don't ignore it. I don't deny it. I sort of integrate it into myself. I accept it, and it becomes part of my new reality and a part that I knew was coming in some fashion, and those parts will keep coming, but it's not the biggest part of my day or the biggest part of my life. When I talk about bringing this kind of internally referenced thinking to my friends, I'm talking about much bigger conversations about our hearts and about what's important to us and about why we're here and what we want to do and who we want to be. You know, it's a far more joyful conversation than collapse conversations.
Thank you. You covered some really good ground, and I don't mean to be pedantic here, but I want to keep going back from time to time and just fleshing out just a little bit, because you cover a lot of ground in a short period of time when you talk. There are times when what's present for me in a conversation with someone who doesn't have any idea about the realm you're talking about, but it can look and sound almost the same. Mm-hmm. It actually can be that they are choosing not to listen to this next news piece about the fires in Australia or whatever the doom news du jour is. And I can't blame them. I'm not at all trying to judge someone who really has no choice, but really either go into the depth of despair and grief about stuff and just get stuck there, or ignore it, really be willfully ignorant and just try and get through their day. I absolutely understand that. But I just want to underscore one piece of what you just said was that you're not in that kind of willful ignorance or denial, that you actually are aware to a great degree what's going on, but there's a way in which you're able to integrate that into your experience without having it get energetically or emotionally stuck in your system. There's some way that you're able to process it or digest it that you called integrating it into your experience, which still has you be aware, awake, connected with what's actually going on in the world, and then being able to choose volitionally to engage in another topic, in another way with people that is not spiritual bypass. It is actually an informed choice of, got this information, process it, it's here duly noted, and my heart is open to it, and I'm now choosing to engage in this other topic, in this other way, with my friends or associates and so on. So thanks for sitting through. I know you just said all these things. I'm just wanting to recap it in perhaps a just slightly simpler way so that people like myself can just follow with you and not get confused with what can often show up, which is the spiritual bypass, the denial, the willful ignorance, because we're really good at that. As a culture, as a global culture, we're really good at that. So good at it that I think it's going to end up taking us down. Is there anything I said in that recap that you'd like to correct or shift or say differently? And if not, is there another direction you'd like to go?
I wouldn't correct what you said. I think for a long time, for years, I had a quote from Marianne Williamson on my refrigerator that said something like, we're more afraid of how powerful we are than of being small. Mm-hmm. And I think that's true. I think the way that you take in what's happening right now and continue to be joyful, it's not even despite it. It's accepting it and saying, yes, and this is my life. This is what I'm doing in this moment. That is happening. That is even affecting me. And this is still what I choose, which is joy or peace or whatever it is I choose in any given moment. And I think that's because I know how big I am now. And maybe people do those other things because they don't believe that they're big.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. I have a direction I'd like to go, but I just want to say it again. If there's a shift of any kind that you're inclined to do, no?
Let's go your way. I'm ready.
Okay. So there's another piece or a distinction seems implied in this work that you, as little as I've understood or experienced of it, that involves an ever greater facility with being able to experience a malleability to who I experience myself to be and how I experience myself to be. I know that Louise's words or Sheila's words and so on, which, by the way, for those who are watching this podcast and have not seen any of the other related podcasts, there you can look up In the Poetry of Predicament on YouTube and find my earlier interview with Sheila Winter Wallace, with Louise LeBrun, with Deb Ozarko, Deb Gleason, and so on, and a number of others. One part of these advanced practices, whether it's this lineage or any of the others that I have the privilege of connecting with, they all have some aspect of a toolkit or a skill set, an experiential reference for what it's like to start to soften or diffuse the edges of who I think I am, of how I experience this thing called me and this thing that I call the world. One way of describing it is a liquid state. I start to experience a liquidity where what I've been taught, and I think what most of us are taught, is this world is solid and who I am is solid and my opinions are solid and my judgments are solid and the world is solid, and the more I hold on to it gives me some sort of reassurance, even though it's fear-based and so on. It gives me some reassurance that I'm holding on tight, and that means I'm stronger in my reality. So I know that that's a little cartoonish, but hopefully it's communicating. And what the liquid state seems to imply is, in this work, in this safe container that is any of these advanced practices lineages that we're talking about, particularly the well systems thing at this point, is there, instead of resisting or fearing or backpedaling from anything that brings on uncertainty. Uncertainty is like a kryptonite, is something to be avoided at all costs. And somehow these lineages, somehow these bodies of work, all of them are involve an encouragement to, instead of backpedaling, becoming more and more familiar to the point where we're actually leaning into that uncertainty, into that those diffuse borders. All of a sudden, I'm leaning into that I actually don't know who I am in this moment in that old way. It's a very malleable thing, this called me in this moment. So let me just stop there. I think I've probably overtalked it anyway. I'm curious if that sparks you to say anything about your experience.
I'm familiar with that. Moving into what's uncomfortable, both in the external world, what looks like the external world, and inside myself, is imperative to getting to know myself and trust myself and feel well. To reach any degree of peace, much less joy, I've had to move toward the discomfort over and over again. It's not the same as living in discomfort because it passes, but hiding from it really just makes it bigger and more painful, in my experience.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Important distinction that you just said that neither of us is talking about leaning into it and then staying in some god-awful state for the rest of our lives, but that this is a periodic experience that we choose whenever we can, whenever we have the choice of choosing, we choose to lean into that which is calling for our attention. And oftentimes that can be a very uncomfortable thing. I remember Deb Gleason in the recent conversation, I won't get it right, but her way of describing that was something like, it's never fun. This is not a fun thing. But if I now know, I've done it enough times to know, if I lean into this thing and I pierce through that, in my words, the membrane of resistance and the uncomfortable, the not fun part, that consistently there's more aliveness, more life on the other side. Does that spark you to say anything?
Yes, because it's funny. I think people might think that, I think I used to believe that if I got through that membrane, the other side would be the comfort I had known before. And why would I go through that just to get to what I had before? Why doesn't it just go away? But it's actually a deeper level of comfort and joy. It's more living. When you go through the membrane, you find out that the membrane was holding you back all along. It wasn't just appearing in that moment. It was probably appearing over and over throughout your life. And thank God you finally sloughed it off and got through it, because now you get this new level of freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great. That's the way I want to live.
Yeah.
That feels awesome.
It's written on your face. Yeah, really good. So Melissa, I'm feeling the envelope of our time together starting to draw to a close, and it seems like more and more in 2020 and beyond, there are going to be more and more people who watch these podcasts and listen to people like yourself who are sharing their direct experience of advanced practices. And these are people from all different levels of engagement with these issues. So, you know, some will be just brand new, like their heads exploding just at the initial onset of what's going on. And others will be grappling with their own sort of approaching advanced practices and so on. I'm curious, is there anything you can share that would help people bridge from whatever they're grappling with in their business as usual lives as they start to consider the possibility that there might be another way to live, there might be another way to encounter life in this experience, in this moment, that is actually, to quote the title of Deb Ozarko's book, that is beyond hope, that level of the despair, grief binary of that hope is some flimsy little thing we try and wave in front of this tsunami, thinking it'll somehow help us. Mm-hmm. And what you've been sharing with us for this past hour is something so beyond that, and obviously what Deb is in her book and so on. Is there anything you could share that might help someone bridge to another possibility? Anything you could suggest or share that might help someone bridge?
It's hard to know what would help other people. I think of myself, what was it, like a year ago, a little more than a year ago. And I mean, I think things happened exactly as they should have. People's lives unfold as they should. If there are people listening who have an inkling that what they're doing isn't going to get them there, if they're activists and they don't see the change really coming, like if it's a form of activism that looks like, you know, fighting the good fight as you go down, or if they aren't activists but they know that this climate thing is getting pretty bad and might get us, but are afraid to acknowledge that. I think if there are people in those situations who have any inkling inside themselves that there might be a way to freedom inside themselves, that if they just got to know themselves better, or some people might call it followed a spiritual path 100%, I'd suggest they follow that intuition and see where it leads them.
Fair enough. All right. Well, how these conversations are going for me these days, and this is no exception, is that I feel like for about an hour or so, I get to be with your generous sharing of a very important kind of experience that I really wish for more people. Again, that naive part of me that I mentioned earlier. And I don't know how many people will actually take on the kind of work that you're describing, having integrated into your life. But there's kind of a joy in that naive part of me, a joy that I really can't imagine something I'd rather be doing right at this moment than speaking with somebody like yourself who has something to say about being ever more alive and more aware, more present and presenced in the face of global scale stressors that humanity has never had to face before. I think that's worth getting out of bed for in the morning, to have this kind of conversation, to be talking about that kind of developing that kind of skill set and that kind of capacity. I think that's worth talking about.
Yeah, I love it.
Very
I
moving.
love talking about this. I love that you do these, and I love that you do these conversations and that you're putting the word out. And if more people want to come talk about this, all the better for me. You know, that would be fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, Melissa, Allison, thank you so much for taking the time to be a part of one of these conversations. I really appreciate and admire your ability to articulate the way you do and share the way you do. And I obviously admire the body of work that you're a part of and that you've shared about. I just wish you well, and I look forward to many, many opportunities in the future for you and me to connect. I don't know if it'll be projects or just fun hanging out at some point. Doesn't matter. But I so look forward to it. And again, I thank you.
Thank you. Great talking to you.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.